The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a vast sea of heat, shimmer, and earth. Against this backdrop, the shooting range came alive like a small fortress of noise and pride. Dozens of marksmen lined up, each one equipped with rifles that seemed to speak the language of seriousness, sleek black barrels, rugged camouflage paint jobs, heavy scopes glinting under the sun. They were here for more than just practice. This was a gathering ground for egos, reputations, and bragging rights. And then Carter walked in. She wasn't imposing, slender, quiet, her dark hair tied back in a loose braid. But what drew every eye wasn't her presence. It was the rifle she carried. The weapon stood out like a streak of rebellion against the desert tones, a rifle painted in a bold, unapologetic matte red. No camouflage, no attempt at blending in, just fire-red steel and polymer, carried with a quiet confidence. The laughter began almost immediately. "Look at that thing," one man said, nudging his friend with a smirk. "Did she pull that out of a toy store?" Another chuckled. "Guess we're doing Fashion Week now," someone else added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Their jokes spread quickly, laughter rolling like thunder across the benches. To them, rifles were sacred tools, meant to be subdued, functional, invisible. The idea of painting one red felt like sacrilege. To see a young woman carrying it, on a range dominated by men hardened from military tour, competitions, or decades of hunting, was an even greater offense. Said nothing. She set her case down on the table and began assembling her gear. Every movement was deliberate, precise. She laid out her ammunition in neat rows, adjusted her bipod, and checked her scope. The red rifle caught the sunlight, gleaming defiantly amid the sea of black and camouflage. The mocking didn't stop. "Bet she can't hit past 100 yards with that Barbie blaster. Maybe she thinks the red makes it go faster. Wait until she misses, she'll pack up and cry." His hands never faltered. She adjusted her scope with a slow twist, checked her chamber, then set the rifle down gently as though placing a crown jewel on display. Her expression was unreadable. No anger, no embarrassment, no nervous smile to hide behind. Just calm, quiet focus. The veterans grew restless. They thrived on dismissing newcomers, but something about her silence was unsettling. She wasn't rising to the bait, wasn't trying to defend herself or prove anything. Not yet. A range officer walked past, clipboard in hand, and paused when he saw the rifle. His brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. He'd seen hundreds of shooters over the years, and he knew one thing. Sometimes the loudest arrivals left the quietest results, and sometimes the quietest arrivals left history written in steel and echo. Closed her eyes briefly, taking in a long breath. She had been in rooms like this before, where laughter was the welcome mat, where doubt dripped from every voice. It had been the same in her high school shooting competitions, the same at local ranges, the same in online forums where she posted questions and was told to let the men handle it. But she hadn't come here for them. She had come here for the challenge, for herself, for her grandfather who had taught her that skill was not measured by the color of a rifle, but by the steadiness of a hand and the patience of a soul. When she opened her eyes, she saw only the target. The others kept laughing, but their voices were fading into background static, like radio chatter on a distant station. She had built this rifle herself, piece by piece, saving dollar by dollar. Every screw tightened by her hands, every inch sanded and painted with care. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a reflection of her journey, her stubbornness, her belief that she didn't need to blend in to belong. As she lay prone and pressed her cheek to the stock, the desert sun flared against the rifle's red finish. The crowd laughed again, but this time their laughter carried a hint of unease. For while they saw a young woman with a strange-colored gun, Carter knew something they didn't. She hadn't come to be accepted. She had come to win. And the desert was about to remember her name. Long before the Nevada desert and its doubtful eyes, Carter's world had been defined by wide skis, rolling fields, and the quiet discipline of Montana's backcountry. She had grown up not in luxury, but in simplicity. Her parents had left when she was young, too consumed by their own battles to raise a daughter. It was her grandfather, Thomas Carter, who had taken her in. Thomas was a man of few words and steady hands. A retired marksman, he had lived through decades of precision shooting, first in the military, then as a quiet competitor in long-range challenges. By the time came under his care, he had traded medals and stories for a weathered rocking chair and a rifle that leaned permanently against the porch railing. But Thomas did not believe in wasting lessons. "Patience," he would say as they sat together in the fields, his voice calm against the wind. "The bullet doesn't care about your rush. It listens to the earth. Learn to listen too." From the age of 10, she learned what most shooters overlooked, that the environment was as much an opponent as the target. She studied how wind bent the tall grass, how mirage shimmered above the soil on hot days, how even the earth's rotation tugged on a bullet across distance. He taught her to calculate not with machines, but with instinct sharpened over time. While her classmates played video games or went to dances, spent evenings on the porch, squinting through iron sights, learning to hold her breath steady as the trigger broke like glass beneath her finger. She didn't complain. In fact, she thrived. Each lesson with her grandfather felt like being trusted with a secret language, one spoken only between earth, bullet, and shooter. But her life wasn't easy. Money was always tight. Thomas' pension covered necessities, but if wanted something beyond the basics, she had to earn it. She took odd jobs, stacking hay bales, cleaning, babysitting, even repairing fences, to save money for her dream, her own rifle. By 16, she had scraped together enough to buy a used barrel, a second-hand scope, and scattered parts that looked more like scrap metal than a weapon. Piece by piece she built it, not perfect, not polished, but hers. The paint came later. She had wanted something that wasn't about hiding, blending, or conforming, something that spoke for her when she couldn't. She remembered standing in a hardware store, staring at rows of dull grays, blacks, and greens before her eyes landed on a can of matte crimson spray. It felt reckless. It felt bold. It felt right. Her grandfather raised a brow when he first saw it. "Red?" he asked, as though the very idea of such a thing was unheard of. She had nodded firmly. "If I'm going to carry it, it should be mine, not theirs." He had studied her for a long moment, then chuckled softly. "Stubborn as your grandmother," he muttered, a rare smile tugging at his lips, and that was that. From then on, the rifle was more than a tool, it was a declaration. Every scratch on its red paint told a story of her persistence. Every adjustment marked her growth. It wasn't camouflage, because had no interest in hiding who she was. Yet the rifle also carried weight. With every trigger pull, she carried her grandfather's teachings. With every careful adjustment, she carried the loneliness of being doubted in a world that told her she didn't belong. By 18, she had competed locally, winning small events despite whispers that her success was luck, or favoritism, or simply fluke. She learned to ignore the whispers, the laughter, the rolling eyes. Each time she stepped onto a firing line, she imagined her grandfather watching from the porch, nodding quietly, proud. He passed away a year later. That night she sat on the porch alone, the red rifle across her knees, tears blurring the stars above. His rocking chair sat empty, his voice now only an echo, but his lessons remained, etched deeper than grief could reach. It was his memory that carried her now, across the miles to Nevada, across the mocking laughter of strangers. They saw only a painted gun, carried something much heavier, the weight of a man's legacy, the years of discipline, and the promise that one day she would prove them all wrong. She didn't just carry a red rifle. She carried her past. The sun was climbing higher, burning hot against the Nevada sand as the range officer called everyone to attention. The murmurs quieted, and the sound of boots shifting on gravel replaced the laughter. The challenge was laid out clearly. Shooters would face a series of targets set at increasingly punishing distances, each one farther than the last. Only the boldest, or perhaps the foolish, would attempt the final test, a steel plate set at 6,000 meters, nearly 4 miles away. Even some veterans shook their heads at the distance. Hitting that target wasn't just about accuracy, it bordered on the impossible. Adjusted the strap on her red rifle, her face expressionless. Around her, the other shooters were busy polishing optics, loading magazines, and making small talk. She stood out, not just because of her rifle, but because of her silence. The joke started again, as soon as her name was read off the list. She signed up for 6,000. Good luck, sweetheart. Hope she brought binoculars. She won't even see the plate. Maybe she thinks the red paint will carry the bullet farther. The men laughed, but the range officer did not. He looked at her, studying the calm in her posture. Something about the way she held that rifle told him she wasn't here for comedy. Laid prone on the hot desert earth, unfolding her bipod with practiced care. She set her cheek against the stock, adjusting the eye relief on her scope until the world beyond the glass sharpened into crisp clarity. She wasn't rushing. Her pace was methodical, every adjustment purposeful. The jeering crowd faded into background noise. Her mind worked quickly, silently. Temperature, 98 degrees. Wind, steady but with small gusts to the left. Mirage, shimmering strong off the desert floor, bending light just enough to deceive the eye. She accounted for it all, jotting quick numbers into the small notepad tucked at her side, then entering them into the ballistic app on her phone. The calculations were her ritual, her armor against doubt. Meanwhile, the first competitors took their turns. Bursts of gunfire cracked across the range, some hitting steel, others missing wide. Every clang of a hit was met with approving nods, every miss with groans. The veterans took turns ribbing each other, puffing up their reputations with bravado. Then's turn came. She slid around into the chamber. The brass casing clicked softly, a sound almost swallowed by the desert wind. She inhaled deeply, letting her chest rise, then slowly exhaled. Her finger rested lightly against the trigger, pressure building with the patience her grandfather had drilled into her. At 1,000 meters, the target seemed generous in size. She steadied, squeezed, crack. A pause, then clang. The steel rang true. The laughter dipped for a moment but quickly returned. Even rookies can land at 1,000, someone muttered. Didn't flinch. She chambered another round, lined up for 2,000 meters and fired. Again, the faint metallic ping echoed back. Then 3,000 meters, another hit. By now, the veterans weren't laughing. They leaned forward, shading their eyes, watching closer. Something in her rhythm was unnerving. She wasn't fumbling, wasn't second-guessing. Each adjustment was precise, each shot deliberate. The air grew heavier with tension. Her red rifle gleamed in the sun, no longer a joke but a statement. Still, whispers rippled through the crowd. She won't make it to 4,000, just wait. She's lucky so far, nobody keeps that up. Block them out. She adjusted her scope again, her hands steady, her breathing calm. For her, this wasn't about luck. This was muscle memory, years of repetition, and lessons that had been carved into her by long Montana summers. She had been mocked too many times to count. This was nothing new. What was new, though, was the challenge itself. 6,000 meters wasn't just a test of skill, it was a war between shooter and nature. Every variable mattered, every fraction of a second held weight. The veterans knew it. As she set her sights on the next distance, her grandfather's words whispered in her mind. The bullet doesn't care about their noise. It only cares about your truth. The crowd leaned in, waiting for her first miss, desperate to reclaim their sense of superiority. But wasn't shooting for them. She was shooting for something much larger. And as the desert wind curled around her red rifle, the trial by fire had only just begun. The Nevada air shimmered like liquid glass as the day stretched toward its hottest hours. The desert was unforgiving, and so were the men who had gathered here. Yet, shot by shot, Carter was reshaping the atmosphere of the range. At 1,000 meters, the hit had been expected, dismissed as nothing more than beginner's luck. At 2,000, she'd earned a few raised eyebrows. By the time her red rifle sang out at 3,000 meters and the steel plate echoed back with a clear metallic ring, the range had grown strangely quiet. The laughter that had greeted her arrival was fading, replaced by an unsettled hush. The veterans who once leaned back smugly in their chairs now leaned forward, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her scope. Even the cockiest among them, men who thrived on deriding newcomers, had begun watching more closely than they cared to admit. However, didn't notice them. She lay prone against the desert floor, cheek resting against the stock of her rifle. The texture of the dry earth pressed against her elbows, heat seeping into her bones. Sweat gathered along her brow, but her breathing remained steady. Each inhale was deep, controlled. Each exhale slowed her pulse until all she could hear was the rhythm of her own body aligning with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Through her scope, the world was narrowed down to one simple truth: target and distance. She adjusted the windage slightly, accounting for the subtle push of a side breeze she had tracked earlier. Her mind measured things most of the crowd couldn't see: mirage waves distorting light, the invisible tug of gravity pulling harder the farther the bullet traveled, the faint, irregular gusts that flickered across the desert like whispers. The red rifle wasn't just an oddity in her hands, it was an extension of her will. Crack! At 4,000 meters, the first round went wide, striking dirt a few feet from the steel. The gallery behind her erupted again, their voices filling with mock relief. There it is, finally showing her limits. Knew that toy rifle couldn't handle distance. She's out of her league now. But didn't blink. She didn't rush to chamber another round or curse under her breath like so many did when frustration set in. Instead, she lifted her head slightly, scanned the mirage through her spotting scope, and recalculated. She wrote quick adjustments in her notebook, then made minute corrections to her scope turret. Her grandfather's voice, calm and steady, echoed in her mind. Missing isn't failure. Missing is information. Listen to what the earth is telling you. She listened. The laughter swelled behind her but shut it out. She pressed her cheek back against the stock, adjusted her breathing, and settled into her rhythm once more. Crack! This time the wait was long. The distance stretched the silence until every eye was fixed on the steel plate. Then clang. The faint metallic echo rippled across the range. The laughter died mid-sentence. A few men shifted uncomfortably, others muttered under their breath, but none could ignore what they had just witnessed. Exhaled slowly, her face as calm as if she had expected nothing else. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't relieved. She was simply in control. The silence deepened as she prepared for the next distance. The desert seemed to hold its breath with her. By now, her red rifle no longer looked like a novelty. It gleamed like a statement, burning against the muted backdrop of sand and stone. Every man who had mocked it was beginning to see it differently, not as a toy, but as a weapon wielded by someone whose discipline dwarfed their arrogance. Still, whispers lingered. Lucky shot. Let's see her try 5,000. But their voices had lost conviction. Wiped the sweat from her brow, adjusted her bipod, and sighted in on the next plate. Her breathing slowed again, her mind narrowing until the crowd, the heat, the noise all fell away. For her, there was only the target. And as the sun blazed down on the Nevada desert, the range stood in tense, awestruck silence, waiting to see how far the red rifle, and the woman who carried it, could truly go. By the time shifted her focus toward the 5,000-meter plate, the desert had begun to show its side. The sun beat down with relentless heat, and a sharp crosswind swept across the range, raising faint curtains of dust. Even seasoned marksmen muttered under their breath, shaking their heads at the conditions. Hitting at this distance was already a test of physics and patience. In this weather, it became something closer to impossible. didn't flinch. She rolled her shoulders back, flexed her fingers, and began making her calculations. Wind speed, angle, mirage distortion, elevation correction, every factor mattered. She scribbled numbers into her notebook, running the math twice, 3 times, knowing that one miscalculation could send her round flying off into nowhere. Behind her, the veterans found their voices again. She won't land this, not in this wind. 4,000 was her ceiling. She should quit while she's ahead. Cute rifle, though. At least it photographs well. The laughter returned, sharp and biting, their earlier unease giving way to renewed arrogance. For them, this was the natural order of things being restored. She had impressed them, yes, but no one could step into their world and simply rewrite the rules. Adjusted her scope, steadied her breathing, and pressed her cheek against the stock. Her eyes narrowed on the tiny speck of steel shimmering at 5,000 meters. Crack! The sound echoed across the desert, followed by a long, stretching silence. Spotters tracked the round's arc, but it landed far wide, kicking up a cloud of dust nowhere near the plate. The gallery roared with laughter. There it is. Knew she couldn't keep it up. Pack it up, Red Rifle, your luck's run dry. Stayed perfectly still. She didn't curse, didn't show frustration. Instead, she lifted her head slowly, adjusted her scope, and reached for her notebook again. Her pencil scratched across the page, noting the bullet's deviation. She replayed the shot in her mind, dissecting what the wind had done, where the mirage had bent her view, how the Earth's spin had dragged the bullet ever so slightly. The noise behind her grew louder, men clapping each other on the shoulders, reclaiming their smug grins. To them, she had finally cracked. But wasn't done. She chambered another round, steadied her breathing, and whispered her grandfather's mantra under her breath. Missing isn't failure. Missing is information. Use it. Her hands moved with precision, adjusting elevation, dialing in windage, compensating for drift. She inhaled deeply, let the air out slowly, and pressed the trigger once more. Crack! The seconds crawled by, the bullet invisible against the vastness of desert air. The range officer, watching through his spotting scope, stiffened. Then clang. A faint metallic echo rippled across the range. The laughter stopped instantly, as though someone had cut the sound. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, broken by the hollow ring of steel struck from 3 miles away. The men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, their smirks wiped clean. Lowered her rifle just long enough to jot down her revised calculations. No gloating, no smile, just discipline. She wasn't here to savor their silence. She was here to master the shot. But the mood had shifted again. The men who had mocked her so gleefully were quieter now, their voices subdued. They couldn't deny what they had seen, her composure under pressure, her ability to adapt. Most shooters fell apart after a miss, their confidence unraveling with every failure, however, had grown sharper. The Red Rifle gleamed against the desert sun, no longer the butt of jokes but a banner of defiance. And yet ahead of her loomed the final challenge, 6,000 meters, a shot that bordered on the impossible, a shot that would either make her a legend or confirm every cruel word spoken against her. As prepared for the ultimate distance, the range held its breath. This was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about proving herself right. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, shimmering under the brutal afternoon sun. Dust devils twisted in the distance, and the air seemed to ripple with heat. The crowd of shooters and spectators had grown tense, no longer laughing openly but murmuring in low voices. Everyone knew what came next. The final plate, 6,000 meters away, almost 4 miles. Even for seasoned veterans, this distance was a monster. At that range, bullets didn't just travel, they bent, drifted, and fought against physics itself. A gust of wind could move a round off course by yards. The effect, Earth's rotation, humidity, even the temperature of the barrel, all conspired against the shooter. Most hadn't even attempted it. Now all eyes were on Carter. She lay prone against the desert floor, the red rifle steady on its bipod. Her breathing was slow, methodical, her body molded into the earth as though she had become part of it. Through her scope, the target was almost invisible, a faint speck of steel dancing in the haze. Behind her, the veterans muttered, 6,000, no way. She can't even see the plate properly. This isn't skill anymore, it's luck. But their voices lacked conviction. The same men who had mocked her arrival now spoke with unease, as though afraid of what might happen if she succeeded. Ignored them. She flipped open her notebook, running numbers furiously. She accounted for the crosswind, its strength shifting every few seconds. She recalculated elevation drop, adjusted for spin drift, and scribbled notes about the mirage distortion. Her pencil moved like a surgeon's scalpel, quick, precise, unflinching. Then she closed the notebook. The math was done. Now came the part her grandfather had drilled into her over years of Montana evenings: trust. She adjusted her scope one last time, her hands steady despite the heat baking the ground beneath her. She rolled her shoulders, settled her cheek against the red rifle stock, and let her breathing slow. The world narrowed. There was no laughter, no doubt, no noise. There was only her heartbeat, the trigger beneath her finger, and a target shimmering in the distance like a mirage. She whispered to herself, so quietly no one else could hear, "Distance is only fear stretched out." And then she fired. Crack! The bullet tore from the muzzle, vanishing instantly into the desert. Through her scope, she saw nothing but heat shimmer. The air hung heavy with silence. The crowd, the veterans, even the range officer, everyone froze, straining to hear, to see, to know. The seconds dragged. At this distance, time felt stretched, each moment an eternity. Some shook their heads, muttering that it was impossible. Others stood in silence, unwilling to break the tension. Didn't move. She didn't lift her head. Her cheek pressed against the stock, her eye glued to the scope. She waited. The desert offered no mercy, only silence. She thought of her grandfather's voice, calm and steady. Trust the shot. If you've done the work, the bullet will find its truth. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight of years. Behind her, a man scoffed. She missed, I told you. Clang. The sound was faint, delayed, but undeniable. A metallic ring drifted across the desert air, distant yet clear, echoing like a ghost. The crowd erupted in gasps. Some swore under their breath. Others turned to one another in disbelief. A few simply stared, mouths open, unable to process what they had just heard. Lowered her rifle slowly, her face calm, her breathing steady. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. For her, this wasn't victory, it was validation. It was proof that every long night, every sacrifice, every lesson from her grandfather had led to this moment. The red rifle gleamed in the sun, no longer a curiosity or a joke. It was legend now, forged in steel and silence. And though the desert had tried to break her, Carter had bent it to her will, with a single, impossible shot. For a long moment after the faint metallic clang rippled across the desert, no one moved. The Nevada air, once thick with laughter and scoffs, had fallen into a stunned silence. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath along with the crowd. Remained prone, her cheek still resting against the stock of her red rifle, as if she hadn't quite left the shot behind. She wasn't basking in the reaction, wasn't waiting for applause. Her focus lingered on the steel plate 6,000 meters away, as though she were confirming in her mind that it had truly happened, that the impossible had been done. Behind her, the men who had mocked her most loudly now looked as though they'd swallowed sand. One had his mouth open, but no words came out. Another rubbed his eyes and checked through his own spotting scope again, desperate to confirm what his ears had already told him. The range officer lowered his binoculars slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. Hit, at 6,000, he muttered, almost to himself, as if saying it aloud might help him accept it. Whispers rippled through the crowd. She actually did it. No one's ever how. That shot shouldn't even be possible. Sat up, brushing dust from her arms. Her movements were calm, almost ritualistic. She lifted the rifle, checked its chamber, and set it gently beside her. To her, the red rifle was more than a weapon. It was a partner, a reminder of her grandfather, and a vessel for discipline and patience. The men who had once laughed now couldn't meet her eyes. Their bravado had dissolved, replaced by a quiet reverence they didn't quite know how to express. A few stepped back, giving her space as though in the presence of something sacred. But wasn't thinking about them. Her thoughts drifted to Montana, to evenings where she and her grandfather had lain side by side in tall grass, staring at distant fence posts as if they were targets on the moon. She remembered his steady voice guiding her through her first 1,000-yard attempt, the way he told her that patience was worth more than pride, that humility was the sharpest weapon of all. "The shot doesn't define you," he had said once. "How you carry it afterward does." Rose to her feet, dusting herself off. She didn't bow or grin or raise her hands in triumph. She simply slung the rifle over her shoulder, its red paint glinting against the sun. The silence that followed her movement felt heavier than applause. Finally, one of the veterans broke the spell. He stepped forward, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "That was history," he said simply. Another nodded. "I've been shooting 30 years and never seen anything like it." Their words carried no mockery now, no sharp edge of arrogance. Instead, they sounded like confessions, acknowledgments of a truth they could no longer deny. Gave them a small nod, nothing more. She wasn't here to crush egos or demand recognition. She was here because she believed in the shot, in the process, in the craft. As the whispers spread, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as ridicule had transformed into awe. Men who once dismissed her now stood in her shadow, witnesses to a feat they would retell for years to come. But wasn't listening. She walked toward the edge of the range, each step steady and unhurried. The desert stretched before her, endless and golden. Behind her, the murmurs of disbelief and reverence followed like a distant echo, but her mind was quiet. The shot was over. The noise, the doubts, the laughter, they belonged to others. For her, the silence afterward was enough. Because in that silence, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice again, proud and calm, reminding her that she had carried the rifle and herself, exactly as he had taught her. The range had been silenced, but more importantly, so had every doubt within her. And that was the real victory. By evening, the desert had cooled, but the heat of shot still burned in the minds of everyone present. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, the crowd finally began to disperse. Yet no one left the same way they had arrived. Men who had once smirked and joked carried heavy silence, their expressions thoughtful, their pride tempered. They had not just witnessed a shot, they had witnessed the rewriting of what was thought possible. Remained near the edge of the range, her red rifle resting against her shoulder. She wasn't basking in attention, though several reporters and photographers circled nervously, unsure if they dared approach. Her eyes lingered on the horizon instead, where the mountains rose like dark sentinels. The steel plate 6,000 meters away caught the last glimmer of sunlight, a faint reminder of what she had done. Word spread quickly. Videos recorded on phones zipped across forums and social media within hours. Grainy clips of her prone figure, the rifle's crack, and the faint, delayed clang of steel began to circulate among shooting communities, then military analysts, then the general public. Each retelling seemed to magnify the impossibility of the shot, yet none could capture the quiet intensity of the moment itself. By the next morning, headlines appeared. Unknown woman lands, 6,000 M rifle shot in Nevada. The red rifle, impossible shot stuns experts. History made on a desert range. Back at the range, veterans who had mocked her now argued fiercely about the technicals, their pride forcing them to wrestle with the evidence. Some insisted it was a fluke. Others admitted, albeit grudgingly, that the calculations and skill required bordered on genius. But beneath all the debate, one truth remained. Carter had done what none of them could. For however, fame was never the goal. She avoided interviews, brushing off offers from sponsors and equipment manufacturers who wanted her face beside their logos. Instead, she returned to Montana, to the wide fields and open skis where her journey had begun. Neighbors who had known her since childhood now regarded her with quiet pride, though shrugged it off with her usual humility. To her, she was the same girl who had lain in tall grass, counting fence posts with her grandfather, learning patience in the silence. Still, she couldn't ignore what had changed. Letters began to arrive, some from young women inspired by her story, others from soldiers thanking her for proving what many had dismissed as impossible. She read each one carefully, often setting them aside with a thoughtful smile. In shooting circles, the red rifle became legend. Discussions of ballistics and technique now carried her name. Some used her feat as a benchmark, a goal to chase. Others dismissed it as an outlier, something too rare to repeat. But whether they admired or doubted, they all spoke of her. And she simply kept shooting. Not for records, not for recognition, but for the love of the craft and the memory of the man who had taught her. Every time she laid prone in the Montana fields, she felt close to her grandfather again, his lessons alive in every breath and every squeeze of the trigger. Years later, when people spoke of the Nevada range, they remembered more than a shot. They remembered the silence that followed, the way the desert itself seemed to bow to her will. They remembered the laughter that died, the pride that faltered, and the red rifle that turned ridicule into reverence. And though Carter never sought to be a symbol, she became one anyway, not just for shooters, but for anyone told they weren't enough, anyone mocked for daring to try. Because on that day, in the heart of the Nevada desert, a young woman silenced more than steel. She silenced doubt, she silenced arrogance. And with a single shot at 6,000 meters, she carved her name into history, quietly, humbly, and unforgettably.